The first thing Jake noticed about Kepler Station wasn't its gleaming corridors or the breathtaking view of the binary star system through the massive viewport. It was the silence that fell over the central hub as soon as he walked in with Brutus padding beside him. "Holy void," whispered a Centaurian trader, its blue-scaled face turning an alarming shade of purple. "Is that a Terran death beast?" Jake looked down at his companion. All 30 pounds of black and white fury currently sniffing around a discarded food wrapper. "Brutus? He's just a honey badger. My emotional support animal." The Centaurian's 4 eyes widened. "Emotional support?" "Yeah, my therapist back on Earth said he'd help with my anxiety about being the youngest student ever accepted into the Galactic Engineering Corps." Jake adjusted his worn backpack, trying to ignore how everyone was staring. At 17, he was used to being the odd one out, but this felt different. More fearful. Station Administrator Zektal, a towering Altarian with silver fur and dignified bearing, approached with what Jake hoped was a welcoming expression. "Welcome to Kepler Station, young Terran. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Yes, sir, thank you. I'm Jake Thompson, reporting for my engineering internship." He gestured to his companion. "This is Brutus. I have all his documentation." A thunderous roar echoed through the hub, so loud that several smaller aliens dove for cover. Jake felt the vibration in his chest as heavy footsteps approached from the residential sector. The crowd parted like water, species that had been chatting moments before suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. "Oh no," Zektel muttered, his ears flattening. "Not again." Through the dispersing crowd emerged the source of the disturbance. 12 feet of rippling muscle and razor-sharp teeth, covered in mottled green scales that seemed to absorb the station's lighting. The creature moved on 4 powerful legs, but its torso was upright and humanoid, with arms that ended in claws the length of dinner knives. Its head was pure nightmare fuel, elongated like a crocodile's but with intelligence blazing in its yellow eyes. "Carthak," Zektal said under his breath. "A Draconis Majoris native. He's been problematic." The massive carnivore's gaze swept the hub before settling on Jake. A grin spread across its maw, revealing teeth that could probably bite through steel plating. Well, Carthak rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "What do we have here? Another soft little mammal for the station menagerie?" His laugh was like breaking glass. "And it brought a snack." Jake felt his heart rate spike, but Brutus just continued sniffing around, completely unbothered by the presence of something that could swallow him whole. The honey badger's lack of concern was oddly comforting. "I'm just here for my internship," Jake said, proud that his voice only shook a little. "Internship." Carthak took a step closer, and Jake caught a whiff of something that smelled like rotting meat and sulfur. "This station doesn't need more weaklings. Perhaps you should return to whatever soft world spawned you before something unfortunate happens." "Now see here, Carthak," Zektal interjected, but the massive predator silenced him with a look. "The administrator and I have an understanding," Carthak said, never taking his eyes off Jake. "Don't we, Zektal?" The Altarian's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Just try not to break anything else." Jake watched this exchange with growing unease. It was clear that this Carthak had turned the station into his personal kingdom through intimidation. The other residents were terrified of him. "Smart," Carthak said, nodding approvingly at Zektal before turning back to Jake. "Now then, little human, here's how things work on my station. You keep your head down, you don't speak unless spoken to, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let you finish your little internship." He leaned down, bringing his massive head level with Jake's. "Step out of line, and I'll use your bones to pick my teeth. Are we clear?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Brutus chose that moment to finish with the food wrapper and start grooming himself, making small grunting sounds of satisfaction. The honey badger looked up at Carthak with the kind of mild interest usually reserved for mildly interesting rocks. Something about his companion's complete lack of fear steadied Jake's nerves. "Crystal clear," he said. Carthak's grin widened. "Excellent. Oh, and human? Next time you bring me a snack, make sure there's more meat on it. That little morsel won't even be a good appetizer." With that, he turned and stalked away, his claws clicking on the metal deck plating. As soon as the predator was out of sight, the hub returned to its normal activity level, though Jake noticed people giving him a wide berth. Zektal approached with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," the administrator said quietly. "Carthak has been difficult since he arrived 3 months ago. His family has significant influence in the Draconis system, and his complaints could shut down this station. So you just let him terrorize everyone? What choice do we have? He's never technically broken any laws, just bent them. And anyone who stands up to him." Zektal gestured to a Vesperan engineer limping past with one wing in a sling. Engineer Rixtal tried to file a complaint about harassment. The next day, she had an unfortunate accident during a routine maintenance check. Jake looked down at Brutus, who had apparently decided the conversation was boring and was now investigating a small maintenance hatch. "What about station security? The security chief resigned last week. Said he was pursuing other opportunities." Zektal's tone made it clear what he thought of that excuse. "Carthak has made it very clear that any security personnel who inconvenience him will find their posting here very uncomfortable. So everyone just lives in fear? It's not ideal, but it's survival." Zektal began walking toward the residential sector, gesturing for Jake to follow. "Come, let me show you to your quarters. Try to stay out of his way, young one. I've grown fond of this station, and I'd hate to see it lose its first human intern so quickly." As they walked, Jake couldn't help but notice how the other residents moved. Always checking corners, never lingering in open spaces, constantly looking over their shoulders. It was like watching prey animals in a nature documentary. "This isn't right," Jake muttered. "No," Zektal agreed quietly. "It isn't, but sometimes wrong is all we have." Jake looked down at Brutus again. The honey badger met his gaze with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to say, "Don't worry, kid. I've got your back." For the first time since arriving at Kepler Station, Jake smiled. 3 days into his internship, Jake had settled into a routine. Morning maintenance rounds with Chief Engineer Veltar, a 6-armed mechanist who spoke in binary and treated every piece of equipment like a beloved pet. Afternoon classes in xenotechnology theory. Evening meals in his quarters, sharing synthesized protein bars with Brutus while reviewing technical manuals. It would have been perfect if not for Carthak. The massive predator seemed to have a sixth sense for when Jake was getting comfortable. Every time the young human started to relax, there would be that distinctive sound of claws on metal, followed by that sulfurous smell that announced the Draconis' presence. "Still here, little snack?" Carthak rumbled, appearing in the doorway of the engineering bay where Jake was calibrating a power coupling. "I'm surprised you haven't scurried back to your soft little world yet." Jake kept working, though his hands trembled slightly. "Just doing my job." "Your job?" Carthak laughed, the sound echoing off the bulkheads. "Tell me, human, what exactly makes you think you belong here? This is precision work, life or death engineering. One mistake could kill everyone on this station. I scored in the top percentile on all my certification exams," Jake said quietly, not looking up from the coupling. "Tests?" Carthak scoffed. "Anyone can memorize equations and procedures. But when the pressure hits, when lives are on the line, can a soft little mammal like you handle it? Or will you freeze up and get people killed?" Jake's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Brutus, who had been napping in a corner, opened one eye to watch the exchange. "I guess we'll find out," Jake said. "Oh, we will." Carthak moved closer, his massive form blocking out the overhead lights. "And when you fail, when you prove that humans don't belong among real engineers, I'll personally make sure you're on the next transport home." "If you're so concerned about engineering competence," Jake said, finally looking up, "maybe you should take the certification exams yourself. I'd be happy to compare scores." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Carthak's eyes narrowed to slits. "What did you say?" Jake felt his heart hammering, but something in Brutus's steady gaze gave him courage. "I said maybe you should take the exams." Prove you're qualified to judge other people's work. For a moment, Jake thought he was dead. Carthak's claws extended, and his lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed every one of his razor-sharp teeth. But then Chief Engineer Veltar's mechanical voice cut through the tension. Exam scores. Human Jake Thompson, 97.3% composite average. Draconis KRTHAK, no scores on record. No engineering certification on file. Carthak spun to glare at the chief engineer, but Veltar continued processing data with mechanical indifference. Station records indicate KRTHAK passenger manifest listing, diplomatic attaché. No technical qualifications listed. I don't need some machines validation, Carthak snarled. But Jake caught something new in his voice. Uncertainty. Neither do I, Jake said, standing up slowly. My work speaks for itself. For a long moment, Predator and human stared at each other. Then Carthak let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl. Brave words from someone who hides behind a pet. His gaze shifted to Brutus, who was now sitting up and watching the exchange with interest. Tell me, human, what happens when your little friend isn't there to make you feel safe? Brutus isn't just a pet, Jake said. He's family. Family. Carthak seemed to taste the word. How touching. I wonder if he'll still be family when he's scattered across the deck plating. Jake's blood went cold. Are you threatening my companion? I'm simply observing that accidents happen on space stations. Equipment malfunctions. Airlocks cycle unexpectedly. Small animals get lost in ventilation systems and never find their way out. Carthak's grin was pure malice. It would be such a shame if something happened to your emotional support. Before Jake could respond, Carthak turned and stalked out of the engineering bay, leaving behind only the echo of his laughter and the lingering smell of sulfur. Veltar approached, his mechanical appendages clicking with what Jake had learned to recognize as concern. Warning. Draconis individual showing escalated aggression patterns. Recommend increased caution. Yeah, Jake said, his voice shaky. Thanks for the backup with the exam scores. Statement of fact. No backup required. Jake knelt down next to Brutus, who had padded over to investigate his emotional state. The honey badger bumped his head against Jake's hand, a gesture of comfort. He threatened you, buddy, Jake whispered. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Brutus looked up at him with an expression that seemed to say, I'm not worried. Should you be? As Jake scratched behind Brutus's ears, he found himself thinking about his companion's fearless attitude. Honey badgers were known for facing down animals 10 times their size without hesitation. They didn't back down, didn't show fear, didn't let size and intimidation tactics work against them. Maybe it was time to stop acting like prey. What do you think, Brutus? Ready to show this station what humans are really made of? The honey badger's response was to start grooming himself, completely unbothered by the implicit challenge. But Jake could swear he saw a glint in those dark eyes that looked almost like anticipation. The accident happened 2 days later. Jake was in the middle of a complex repair on the station's primary atmospheric processor when the emergency klaxons began wailing. Red lights bathed the engineering section as Veltar's voice echoed through the comm system. Critical malfunction. Section 7 Gamma Atmospheric Recycling Unit. Toxic gas leak detected. All personnel evacuate immediately. Jake's blood turned to ice. Section 7 Gamma was residential housing. His residential housing. Brutus, he whispered, abandoning his work and sprinting toward the residential sector. Emergency bulkheads were slamming shut throughout the station, automated systems trying to contain the leak. Jake had to duck and roll under one barrier, his heart hammering as he navigated the maze of corridors toward his quarters. The closer he got to Section 7 Gamma, the thicker the acrid yellow smoke became. His eyes were streaming, and each breath burned his lungs, but he kept running. Other residents fled past him in the opposite direction. Centaurians, Altarians, even a few of the usually stoic mechanists moving with urgent haste. Kid, stop. Zektal caught his arm as Jake tried to push past him. You can't go in there. The gas concentration is lethal. My companion is in there. Jake struggled against the administrator's grip. The emergency systems sealed all the residential units. If he's in your quarters, he should be safe until the maintenance crews can. A tremendous crash echoed from somewhere ahead, followed by the sound of twisting metal. Through the smoke, Jake could see sparks showering from a damaged ventilation grate. What was that? Zektal demanded, speaking into his comm unit. Maintenance report. What's happening in 7 Gamma? The response was crackling with static. Unknown, sir. Something big hit the ventilation system. Looks like something tore through the ducting from the inside. Jake felt his heart stop. Oh no. Oh no, no, no. He broke free from Zektal's grip and plunged into the smoke-filled corridor. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and the toxic yellow gas made his eyes stream tears, but he kept moving. His quarters were at the end of the corridor, and as he approached, he could see that his door was open. Not just open, torn off its hinges, the metal frame twisted like it had been hit by an explosion. Brutus! Jake called, his voice hoarse from the toxic air. Brutus, where are you? From somewhere in the swirling smoke came a sound that made Jake's blood freeze. Carthak's rumbling laughter. Looking for something, little human? Jake spun toward the voice, trying to see through the dense yellow haze. Where is he? What did you do? Such a shame about the atmospheric malfunction. Carthak's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. These old stations, equipment fails all the time. And sometimes, when small animals get frightened by loud noises and toxic gases, they run into dangerous places. If you hurt him. Another laugh. I haven't laid a claw on your little pet. But the ventilation system, well, it's a maze in there. Easy to get lost. Easy to take a wrong turn and end up somewhere very unpleasant. Jake pulled out his emergency flashlight, sweeping the beam through the smoke. In the distance, he could hear what sounded like scratching and scraping, echoing through the station's ductwork. He's in the vents, Jake whispered. Oh yes, ran right into them when the gas started flowing. Quite the survivor instinct. Carthak's form materialized out of the smoke, his yellow eyes gleaming in the emergency lighting. Unfortunately, some of those ducts lead to the waste processing system, others to the reactor coolant manifolds, and a few, his grin widened, lead directly to the incinerator. Jake felt rage building in his chest, burning hotter than the toxic air. You set this up. You caused the malfunction to force him into the vents. Prove it, Carthak challenged. The station logs will show a perfectly normal equipment failure. These things happen. And if a small animal got scared and ran into a dangerous area, well, that's just natural selection at work. The scratching sounds were getting fainter, more distant. Brutus was moving deeper into the ventilation system, following instincts that told him to get away from the toxic air. But those same instincts were leading him toward even greater dangers. The maintenance crews will find him, Jake said desperately. Will they? Carthak tilted his massive head. The vent system covers 12 square kilometers. Could take days to search it all. And some areas are inaccessible to larger creatures. His claws extended slightly. Of course, someone small enough could follow him. If they were brave enough. Or stupid enough. Jake stared at the torn ventilation grate where the scratching sounds had originated. The opening was barely large enough for a human to squeeze through, and beyond it lay a maze of narrow ducts that could lead anywhere in the station. You're insane if you think I'm going in there. I think you are, Carthak said softly. I think you'll crawl through every meter of ductwork on this station to find your little friend. And when you do, when you're lost and exhausted and running out of air, you'll realize that humans don't belong out here among the real predators. Jake looked at the destroyed door of his quarters, then at the twisted ventilation grate, then at Carthak's smug expression. The massive alien was right about one thing. Jake would go into those vents. He would crawl through every narrow tunnel and face every danger to find Brutus. But not because he was soft or weak or didn't belong here, because that's what family did for each other. When I find him, Jake said quietly. "And when I get him back safely, you and I are going to have a conversation." Carthak's laugh followed him as he dropped to his hands and knees and crawled into the ventilation system. "Good luck, little human. Try not to get lost in the dark." As Jake pulled himself into the narrow duct, one thought burned in his mind. Brutus had never backed down from anything in his life. Neither would Jake. Time to show the station what humans were really made of. The ventilation system was a nightmare of twisting passages, junction boxes, and sudden drops that seemed designed to trap and disorient anyone foolish enough to enter. Jake had been crawling for what felt like hours, following the faint sound of scratching that meant Brutus was somewhere ahead of him in the maze. His knees were raw from the metal grating. His shoulders ached from squeezing through narrow passages, and the flashlight was starting to dim. But he kept moving, pausing at each junction to listen for his companion. "Brutus," he called softly into the darkness ahead. "Brutus, it's okay. I'm coming." A faint grunt echoed back from somewhere to his left. Jake smiled despite his exhaustion. That was definitely Brutus's "I'm annoyed but not in immediate danger" sound. He squeezed through another narrow passage and found himself in a wider maintenance tunnel. Here, finally, he could stand up and stretch his aching back. His flashlight beam revealed scratch marks on the metal walls where Brutus had passed through, along with what looked like small tufts of black and white fur. "Getting close, buddy?" Jake murmured, following the trail deeper into the station's infrastructure. 20 minutes later, he found Brutus. The honey badger was in a circular maintenance chamber, sitting calmly next to a massive piece of equipment that Jake recognized as one of the station's main power coupling nodes. Brutus looked up as Jake's flashlight beam found him, making a small chirping sound that clearly meant, "What took you so long?" "Oh, thank God," Jake breathed, dropping to his knees and pulling his companion into a hug. "I was so worried. Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Brutus submitted to the emotional human contact for exactly 3 seconds before squirming free and returning to what he'd been doing before Jake arrived, investigating the power coupling with intense interest. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" Jake directed his flashlight at the equipment Brutus was examining. At first, everything looked normal, just another industrial power node, humming quietly as it routed energy through the station's systems. But as Jake looked closer, he began to see irregularities. Scratch marks in the metal housing that were too precise to be accidental damage. A panel that was slightly askew, as if it had been recently removed and replaced. And there, almost hidden behind a bundle of cables, something that definitely didn't belong. A small device with blinking lights about the size of a comm unit. "What the hell?" Jake reached for the device, but Brutus made a sharp warning sound and blocked his path. The honey badger looked up at him with an expression that clearly said, "Don't touch that, you idiot." Jake pulled out his scanner and ran it over the mysterious device. The readings made his blood run cold. Electromagnetic pulse generator, currently in standby mode with a timer counting down. 6 hours, 23 minutes, and 37 seconds. "It's a bomb," Jake whispered. "Not exactly a bomb, but if this thing goes off next to the power coupling, it'll cause a cascade failure throughout the entire electrical grid." Brutus made an affirmative sound and resumed sniffing around the coupling node. Within minutes, he'd found 2 more devices, hidden in different parts of the equipment. 3 of them, Jake said, his mind racing. "He didn't just cause the atmospheric malfunction to get you into the vents. This whole thing is cover for sabotage. When these go off, the station will lose all power, life support, artificial gravity, everything." The implications hit him like a freight train. Without power, Kepler Station would become a tomb. The emergency systems might keep a few critical areas running for a day or 2, but with over 3,000 residents, the life support wouldn't last long enough for a rescue ship to arrive. Jake activated his comm unit, but all he got was static. The signal couldn't penetrate through the station's superstructure to reach the main communication array. "We have to get back," he told Brutus. "We have to warn everyone." But as Jake started to retrace their path through the ventilation system, he realized something that made his stomach drop. The scratching and scraping sounds that had led him to Brutus weren't random. They formed a pattern, leading from the initial breach point in residential section to this specific maintenance chamber. Brutus hadn't been running blindly through the vents. He'd been tracking something. "You smelled him, didn't you?" Jake said, looking down at his companion. "You smelled Carthak's scent on these devices, and you followed it here." Brutus looked up at him with an expression that seemed to say, "Finally, the human catches up." "He planted these bombs. The atmospheric malfunction, forcing you into the vents. It was all cover so he could sabotage the power grid without being seen." Jake felt anger burning in his chest. He's going to kill everyone on this station. The question was, why? What did Carthak gain from destroying Kepler Station? Jake thought about what Zektal had said about the Draconis having political influence, about complaints that could shut down the station. "Insurance," Jake whispered. "Or maybe he's being paid by competitors who want the trade route. Doesn't matter. We have to stop him." Jake looked at the 3 sabotage devices, then at his scanner readings, then at Brutus. The honey badger was watching him with patient intelligence, waiting to see what his human would do next. "Okay," Jake said, making his decision. "Here's what we're going to do. I can't disarm these things, they're too sophisticated, and if I make a mistake, they might go off early. But I can trace their signal frequency, find out how Carthak is controlling them." He spent the next 20 minutes running detailed scans on the devices while Brutus kept watch. The results confirmed his suspicions. All 3 devices were linked to a remote control system, probably hidden somewhere in Carthak's quarters. "If we can get to his quarters and find the controller, we can disarm the bombs. But we have to do it without him knowing we're there." Jake looked down at Brutus. "Think you can find his quarters using the scent trail?" Brutus's response was to start heading toward a different ventilation grate, one that Jake was certain led in the opposite direction from their entry point. "I'll take that as a yes," Jake said, following his companion into the darkness. As they navigated through another maze of ducts and passages, Jake found himself thinking about fear. 3 days ago, the thought of confronting Carthak would have paralyzed him. The massive predator was everything Jake wasn't. Big, powerful, dangerous, absolutely confident in his ability to dominate any situation. But Carthak had made a mistake. He'd threatened Brutus, and in doing so, he'd revealed that for all his size and strength and razor-sharp claws, he was afraid of something. Afraid of being shown up by a human kid and his emotional support animal. "Almost there," Jake whispered as they approached another maintenance access panel. "Ready to show this station what humans are really made of?" Brutus's only response was to bare his teeth in what could generously be called a grin. Jake smiled back. They might be small compared to Carthak, but they had something he didn't. They were fighting for family. And that made all the difference. Carthak's quarters were exactly what Jake had expected. Massive furniture built to accommodate his 12-foot frame, decorative weapons mounted on the walls, and the overwhelming smell of sulfur and rotting meat. What Jake hadn't expected was to find the Draconis fast asleep in his oversized bed, snoring like a freight train. "Seriously," Jake whispered to Brutus as they crouched near the ventilation grate they'd emerged from. "He commits sabotage and then takes a nap?" Brutus made a sound that might have been amusement and began sniffing the air. Within seconds, he'd locked onto a scent trail that led toward a desk covered in alien electronics. The remote control device was exactly where Jake had hoped it would be. Sitting in plain sight among Carthak's personal effects, probably because the arrogant predator couldn't imagine anyone being brave enough to break into his quarters. 5 hours, 42 minutes. Jake read from the device's display. "We still have time." The control unit was more sophisticated than Jake had expected, with multiple channels and what looked like override codes for each sabotage device. But the basic principle was simple enough. Find the right frequency, input the disarm command, and, "Going somewhere, little human?" Jake's blood turned to ice. He spun around to see Carthak rising from his bed, his yellow eyes gleaming with malevolent amusement. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the massive predator said, stretching with casual indifference. "How long did it take you to find your pet? And more importantly, how long before you figured out what those devices really were?" "Long enough," Jake said, his hands still on the control unit. I know what you're planning, Carthak. Mass murder for profit. Murder, Carthak laughed. Such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as market correction. Kepler Station has been operating at a loss for 3 years. My employers would much prefer to see it destroyed than continue subsidizing a failed enterprise. Your employers? The Draconis Mining Consortium, of course. We've had our eye on this system for decades, but that pesky treaty prevents us from simply taking what we want. However, if the station were to suffer a tragic accident, Carthak's grin widened. Well, treaties can be renegotiated when there are no survivors to object. Jake felt sick. 3,000 people. You're going to kill 3,000 innocent people for mining rights. Business is business, little human. The weak are consumed by the strong. That's the natural order. Carthak began moving closer, his claws extended. Though I must admit, I'm impressed you made it this far. Most prey animals would have given up by now. We're not prey, Jake said, backing toward the desk. No, Carthak tilted his massive head. Then what are you? Jake's hand closed around the control device. We're engineers. With that, he activated the unit's emergency shutdown command. All 3 sabotage devices deactivated simultaneously, their countdown timers freezing at 5 hours, 37 minutes. Carthak's roar of rage was so loud it rattled the bulkheads. You little! He lunged forward, claws extended, murder blazing in his yellow eyes. Jake dove to the side, but there was nowhere to go in the enclosed space. Carthak was between him and the ventilation grate, and the door was locked from the inside. I'm going to enjoy this, Carthak snarled, advancing slowly now that he had Jake trapped. I'm going to make it last for hours. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be begging me to. Something small and black and white shot out of the shadows like a furry missile, landing on Carthak's back with all the subtlety of a plasma cannon. Brutus had arrived. Carthak's confident advance turned into a frantic dance as 30 pounds of concentrated fury began doing what honey badgers did best, not caring about the size difference and going straight for the most sensitive targets. What? Get it off! Get it off! Carthak spun in circles, trying to reach the honey badger that had latched onto the back of his neck. But Brutus was far too smart and far too quick to be dislodged by simple thrashing. Brutus, no! Jake called out, afraid his companion would be crushed. But the honey badger was in full combat mode now. He'd found purchase on Carthak's thick hide and was methodically working his way toward more vulnerable areas. I'll kill it. I'll tear it apart. Carthak slammed his back against the wall, trying to crush Brutus. But the honey badger simply shifted position and continued his assault. That's when Jake realized something wonderful. Carthak was afraid. The massive predator who had terrorized an entire station, who had planned mass murder for profit, who had built his entire identity around being the biggest, strongest, most dangerous thing in any room. He was utterly terrified of a 30-pound mammal that refused to be intimidated. You know what the funny thing is? Jake said, pulling out his comm unit and activating the recording function. Honey badgers are actually pretty docile most of the time. They only get aggressive when they're protecting their family. Carthak managed to grab Brutus and fling him across the room, but the honey badger landed on his feet and immediately charged back into the fray, this time going for Carthak's legs. Call it off, Carthak demanded, now standing on his bed and trying to keep his feet away from Brutus's reach. Call off your creature. He's not my creature, Jake said, still recording as the 12-foot carnivore cowered from his emotional support animal. He's my family, and families protect each other. Station security arrived 10 minutes later to find a scene that would become legendary throughout the sector. Carthak barricaded in his own bathroom while Brutus sat guard outside the door, occasionally making threatening sounds whenever the Draconis tried to emerge. Jake had spent the time downloading everything from Carthak's personal computer, including detailed schematics of the sabotage plan, financial records showing payments from the Draconis Mining Consortium, and communications proving the entire conspiracy. This should be enough evidence to shut down their mining operation permanently, Jake told Administrator Zektal as security officers led a thoroughly humiliated Carthak away in restraints. And I think the Galactic Trade Commission will be very interested to know about attempted corporate terrorism. Zektal looked down at Brutus, who was now calmly grooming himself as if taking down a 12-foot carnivore was just another Tuesday. I have to ask, young human, is your companion always this effective? Jake scratched behind Brutus's ears, earning a contented grunt. Honey badgers have a reputation back on Earth. They're small, but they don't know it. And they absolutely refuse to back down from anything. Rather like humans, it seems, observed Chief Engineer Veltar, who had arrived to inspect the sabotage devices. Addendum TO Station Records. Veltar announced in his mechanical voice, Human Jake Thompson, cleared for advanced engineering certification. Emotional support animal Brutus, cleared for station security duties. Jake laughed. I don't think Brutus is interested in a career change. But as word of the incident spread throughout Kepler Station, Jake noticed something remarkable happening. The residents who had been living in fear for months were walking taller, speaking louder, meeting each other's eyes again. Engineers who had been intimidated into poor work were suddenly producing innovations that impressed even the mechanists. The entire station seemed to come alive with new energy and confidence. It's amazing what happens when people remember they don't have to be afraid. Zektal mused as he and Jake watched a group of Centaurian traders loudly debating the merits of different cargo routes, something that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. Fear's just another kind of engineering problem, Jake said. You identify the source, analyze its structure, and then you figure out how to neutralize it. And if the source is a 12-foot carnivore with diplomatic immunity? Jake looked down at Brutus, who was now attracting a small crowd of admirers from various species, all wanting to meet the legendary Terran death beast who had taken down Carthak. Then you remind everyone that size isn't everything, Jake said. Sometimes the smallest components in a system are the most important ones. 3 months later, Jake received his certification as a full engineer, the youngest non-AI ever to achieve that status in Galactic Engineering Corps history. Kepler Station was not only fully operational but had become one of the most sought-after postings in the sector, with beings from dozens of species specifically requesting assignment there. And Brutus? Brutus was just happy to have his human back to his normal stress levels. Though he did seem to enjoy the respect he got from other station residents, who had taken to calling him Badger General, and always made sure to save him the best scraps from their meals. As Jake often told visitors to the station, never underestimate the power of family, determination, and 30 pounds of concentrated, I don't care how big you are. Because in the end, that's what humanity brought to the galaxy. Not superior strength or advanced technology, but the absolute refusal to accept that might makes right. The stubborn, illogical, completely irrational belief that even the smallest person could stand up to the biggest bully and win. And sometimes, if they were very lucky, they had a honey badger to help them prove it.